Billionaire CEO fakes death in Lisbon to deceive his wife. But what she did next shocked everyone. She stood over his empty grave in Lisbon, tears streaming down her face, not from grief, but from the satisfaction of knowing he was about to discover that two could play his deadly game. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Westfield estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, as Zara Matthews Westfield stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of their master suite, watching her husband pace the Italian leather furniture below. Even from the second floor, she could see the tension radiating from Douglas Westfield's broad shoulders, the way his manicured fingers raked through his silver hair, a tell she'd learned to recognize over their 8 years of marriage. What do you think drives someone to the point where they'd rather fake their own death than face their problems? Share your thoughts below. Douglas had built Westfield Industries from a small tech startup into a global empire worth $12 billion. But lately, something had been eating at him. The late-night phone calls, spoken in hushed tones, the way his jaw clenched when certain names appeared on his caller ID, the documents he'd hurriedly shove into his safe whenever she entered his study. "Morning, baby," Zara called down, her voice carrying the warm, honeyed tones that had first captivated him at a charity gala in Manhattan. She descended the curved staircase, her silk robe flowing like liquid gold against her deep brown skin, her natural hair caught up in a messy bun that somehow managed to look effortlessly elegant. He looked up, and for a moment, his face softened. At 52, he was still the commanding presence that had drawn him to him. Steel-gray eyes that could cut through boardroom negotiations, a jawline that photographers loved, and hands that had built an empire but still trembled slightly when they touched her. "You're up early," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach those piercing eyes. "Couldn't sleep." She moved to the espresso machine, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar ritual. "You were talking in your sleep again." His entire body went rigid. "What did I say?" "Something about Lisbon, and someone named Victor." The coffee cup slipped from Douglas's fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. The sound seemed to echo through the cavernous kitchen, each shard catching the morning light like accusations. "Jesus, Doug!" She was beside him in an instant, her bare feet carefully navigating the broken pieces. "What's wrong with you lately?" He was already on his knees, gathering the larger pieces with hands that shook harder now. "Nothing. Just work stress. The European expansion is more complicated than we anticipated." Zara knelt beside him, her hand covering his. His skin was cold despite the warmth of the morning, and she could feel the rapid pulse at his wrist. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever's happening, we'll figure it out together."
For a moment, Douglas looked like he might crumble. His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, as if memorizing every detail. Then something shuddered closed behind his gaze, and he was the CEO again, controlled, calculating, untouchable. "I know, sweetheart, I know." He pressed his lips to her forehead, and she caught the faint scent of his cologne mixing with something else. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. "I just need to handle this myself." The housekeeping staff materialized as if summoned by some invisible signal, their movements efficient and silent as they dealt with the broken cup. Zara watched them work, noting how they avoided eye contact with Douglas, how their usual friendly chatter died in his presence. Even the staff sensed the change in him. "I have to fly to Portugal today," Douglas said suddenly, his voice carefully neutral. "Some issues with the Lisbon office that need my personal attention." "Portugal?" Zara's eyebrows rose. "You didn't mention any trip to Portugal." "It came up yesterday, last-minute crisis." He was already moving toward the door, dismissing the conversation. "I'll probably be gone a week, maybe 2. "Doug," her voice stopped him at the threshold. "Are you having an affair?" The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Douglas turned slowly, his face a mask of wounded innocence that she almost believed. "How can you ask me that?" His voice was soft, hurt. "After everything we built together." "Because you're acting like a man with secrets." She crossed her arms, studying him with the analytical mind that had made her a successful prosecutor before she'd met him. "And in my experience, men with secrets are usually either stealing money or sleeping with someone else." Douglas closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that seemed to contradict the desperation in his eyes. "I would never betray you, Zara, never. You're the only good thing in my life." His lips found hers, and for a moment she let herself believe him. He tasted like coffee and mint and something underneath that might have been lies, but his kiss was hungry, desperate, like a man trying to memorize the feeling. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you more than my own life. Don't ever doubt that." 3 hours later, Zara stood in the marble foyer watching Douglas's security team load his luggage into the black Suburban. He'd packed light for a 2-week trip, just 1 suitcase and his laptop case. Through the open door, she could see him on the phone, his voice low and urgent in what sounded like Portuguese. "Mrs. Westfield," James, their head of security, appeared at her elbow. "Mr. Westfield wanted to give you this." She took the envelope, her name written in Douglas's familiar scrawl across the cream-colored paper. Inside was a first-class ticket to Paris, dated for the following week. "He thought you might want to visit your sister while he's handling business. All expenses paid, of course." Zara stared at the ticket, a cold realization settling in her stomach. He was sending her away, making sure she was on the other side of the world when what? "Did he say anything else?" she asked. James hesitated, his weathered face creasing with concern. "He seemed different, ma'am. Emotional. He shook my hand when he left, thanked me for my years of service, almost like he was saying goodbye." Through the window, Zara watched the Suburban disappear down the tree-lined drive, taking her husband toward whatever fate he was racing to meet. She'd built her career on reading people, on sensing when someone was lying, when they were hiding something that could destroy lives. Every instinct she'd honed as a prosecutor was screaming that Douglas Westfield was planning something that would change everything. And she was going to find out what.
Zara jolted awake in their king-sized bed, the silk sheets twisted around her legs like restraints. The phone's shrill ring cut through the darkness, and she knew, the way you always know when a call comes at that hour, that her world was about to shatter. "Miss Westfield?" The voice was heavily accented, formal. "This is Inspector Miguel Santos with the Policia Judiciaria in Lisbon. I am afraid I have some very difficult news regarding your husband." The words seemed to come from underwater, distorted and impossible to grasp. Zara sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs as she reached for the bedside lamp. The sudden light felt like an assault. "There's been an accident," the inspector continued. "A fire at the Westfield Industries office building. Your husband was working late when... I am very sorry, Mrs. Westfield. There were no survivors." The phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the marble floor. She could hear the inspector's voice, tinny and distant, asking if she was still there, but the sound seemed to be coming from another universe entirely. No. The word formed in her mind but wouldn't make it to her lips. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She'd talked to Douglas just 12 hours ago, his voice warm and reassuring over the crackling international connection. "I'll be home soon, sweetheart. Just a few more details to sort out, and then we'll take that vacation to the Maldives we've been planning." She'd been sitting in their garden when he called, deadheading roses while the late afternoon sun painted everything gold. She'd laughed at something he said, the sound carrying across the manicured lawn where the staff was preparing for the dinner party they were supposed to host next weekend. Now those roses would bloom and die while she planned his funeral instead. "Mrs. Westfield," the inspector's voice was closer now. She must have picked up the phone again, though she couldn't remember doing it. "I understand this is a tremendous shock. The Portuguese authorities will need you to come to Lisbon to make arrangements. The American consulate has been notified and will assist with the paperwork." The next hours passed in a blur of nightmarish efficiency. James appeared at her bedside with coffee and sedatives, though she couldn't remember calling him. The family lawyer materialized in the library, his face grave as he explained the procedures for international death certificates. Douglas's assistant called from the New York office, her voice breaking as she offered condolences and asked about postponing the board meeting scheduled for next week. How do you postpone a board meeting when the entire company just lost its soul? Zara found herself thinking in fragments, her mind unable to process the enormity of what had happened. Douglas was supposed to be immortal, untouchable. Men like him didn't die in office fires. They conquered markets and built empires and lived forever out of sheer stubborn will. "I need to go to Lisbon," she said suddenly, interrupting the lawyer's monologue about estate procedures. I need to be there." "Mrs. Westfield, I really don't think—" "Don't." Her voice cut through his protests like a blade. "Don't think, just make the arrangements." Lisbon, 2 days later. The flight from New York to Lisbon felt like traveling through purgatory. Zara sat in first class, surrounded by the luxury Douglas had always insisted upon, staring out the window at clouds that looked like cotton balls soaked in tears. The flight attendants moved around her with practiced sympathy, offering champagne and warm towels as if grief could be soothed by thread count and vintage Dom Perignon. She'd refused the sedatives the doctor had prescribed, choosing instead to feel every razor-sharp edge of her loss. The pain was the only thing that felt real anymore, the only proof that what they had shared had mattered. Inspector Santos met her at the airport, his weathered face kind but professional. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 40, with intelligent, dark eyes and the careful manner of someone who'd delivered too much bad news. "Mrs. Westfield, I want to express my deepest condolences. Your husband was well respected here. The entire business community is in shock." The drive through Lisbon's winding streets felt surreal. The city was beautiful in the way that Douglas had always described. Terracotta rooftops cascading down hillsides, the Tagus River glinting in the afternoon sun, and trams climbing impossible grades with cheerful persistence. It was the kind of place where people fell in love and made memories that lasted lifetimes. Instead, she was here to collect her husband's ashes. The Westfield Industries building, or what was left of it, sat in the heart of the business district like a blackened tooth. The top 3 floors had been completely gutted, their windows blown out and their contents reduced to twisted metal and charcoal. Fire department tape fluttered in the Atlantic breeze, and the acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air despite the rain that had fallen the night before. The fire started around 11 p.m. Your husband was working late, as was his habit, according to his staff. The building sprinkler system malfunctioned, and by the time the fire department arrived, the top floors were completely engulfed. Zara stared at the ruins, trying to imagine Douglas's final moments. Had he been afraid? Had he thought of her? Had he tried to escape? Or had the smoke claimed him before he even knew what was happening? "Where?" Her voice cracked, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "Where was he found?" "His office, top floor, corner suite." The inspector's voice was professionally neutral, but she caught the slight hesitation. "Mrs. Westfield, I should warn you that the The remains were severely damaged by the fire. We were only able to make identification through dental records and his wedding ring. The wedding ring. The simple platinum band she'd slipped onto his finger 8 years ago in a small ceremony in the Hamptons, with just their closest friends and family in attendance. He'd never taken it off, not even for his weekly racquetball games where it got in the way of his grip. "I need to see his office," she said suddenly. "Mrs. Westfield, I really don't think. I need to see where he died." Her voice was steady now, prosecutor sharp. "I need to understand what happened." The inspector studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, but please stay close to me. The structure is not stable." They entered through a side entrance, their footsteps echoing in the hollow shell of what had once been an elegant lobby. The smell of smoke was overwhelming here, mixed with the chemical tang of fire retardant, and something else, something organic and terrible that she tried not to think about. The elevator was destroyed, so they climbed the emergency stairs, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. Each floor told the story of the fire's progression. The lower levels were damaged but recognizable, while the upper floors became increasingly apocalyptic. Douglas's office was completely destroyed. The corner windows were blown out, offering a panoramic view of Lisbon's skyline that was now framed by twisted metal and charcoal. His desk, a massive thing carved from a single piece of Brazilian rosewood, was nothing but ash and metal fittings.
"He was found here," Inspector Santos said quietly, indicating a spot near what had been the window. "The medical examiner believes he was overcome by smoke inhalation before the flames reached him." Zara knelt in the ash, her fingers trembling as she touched the spot where her husband had died. The concrete was still stained with soot, and she could see the outline where his body had been, a shadow burned into the floor like a nuclear afterimage. That's when she saw it. Something glinted in the ash near where the desk had been. She brushed away the soot with her fingers, revealing a small piece of metal, twisted and blackened, but unmistakably part of a laptop computer. Douglas never left his laptop behind, ever. "Inspector," she called, holding up the fragment. "This is from his computer. He always carried it with him, even to the bathroom. He would never have left it behind if he was trying to escape." Santos examined the piece, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps he was trying to save important files when the flames spread too quickly." But Zara was already moving, her trained eye scanning the destruction with new purpose. Douglas had been paranoid about his data. Every important file was backed up in triplicate, stored in multiple locations, accessible from his phone. He wouldn't have risked his life for anything stored on a single laptop. Unless he wasn't trying to save something. Unless he was trying to destroy it. "The fire," she said slowly, pieces clicking into place in her mind. "You said the sprinkler system malfunctioned?" "Yes, a complete system failure. Very unusual for a building of this caliber." "And the security cameras?" "Destroyed in the fire, unfortunately, along with most of the building's electronic systems." Too convenient, too perfect, too much like the kind of thorough cleanup that Douglas would plan if he needed to erase every trace of something. "But he wouldn't fake his own death. He wouldn't put me through this agony. He loved me." The thought felt hollow even as she formed it. Men who loved their wives didn't send them to Paris while they handled mysterious business in Lisbon. They didn't pack light for 2-week trips or speak in hushed tones about people named Victor. "Mrs. Westfield?" Inspector Santos was watching her with concern. "Are you all right?" She stood slowly, brushing ash from her black dress. "I'd like to see the dental records you used to identify my husband." "I'm sorry. The dental records. I'd like to see them." The inspector's face grew carefully neutral. "That's highly irregular. The identification process is complete. There's no need.
There's every need. Her voice carried the authority she'd wielded in courtrooms, the steel that had made her one of New York's most feared prosecutors. I want to see every piece of evidence you used to identify my husband's body. What secrets do you think people are capable of hiding from those they love most? Tell me about a time when you discovered something that changed everything. The dental records were spread across Inspector Santos's desk like accusations. Zara studied them with the methodical intensity she'd once reserved for murder cases, her trained eye searching for inconsistencies, for the kinds of small details that could unravel entire prosecutions. "These records," she said slowly, "they're from Dr. Enrique Voss here in Lisbon." "Yes, your husband's Portuguese dentist. He'd been a patient for several years, according to the records." "Several years?" Zara's voice was flat. "Inspector, my husband was terrified of dentists. He'd been putting off a root canal for 6 months because he couldn't stand the thought of the procedure. He would never have chosen to have dental work done in a foreign country." Santos frowned. Perhaps he had an emergency while traveling. "Then why aren't there any records from his dentist in New York? Dr. Morrison has been treating Douglas for 15 years. These records should show previous work, crown placements, filling materials. There should be continuity." She was thinking out loud now, her prosecutor's mind engaging with the puzzle. "And look at this," she pointed to a notation on the chart. "This shows extensive crown work on the upper molars, but Douglas had perfect teeth, never had a cavity in his life. It was something he was annoyingly proud of." The inspector leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Mrs. Westfield, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that someone went to a great deal of trouble to create a false identity for a body that was never my husband's." The words hung in the air between them like a detonated bomb. Santos stared at her, his expression shifting from professional sympathy to sharp attention. "That's a very serious accusation." "I'm a very serious person." She gathered the dental records, her hand steadied despite the earthquake happening in her chest. "Inspector, I need you to run DNA tests on whatever remains you have. Compare them to samples from our home in Connecticut. Mrs. Westfield, and I need you to pull the financial records for Westfield Industries' Lisbon operation, all of them, going back 2 years. "I'm not sure I have the authority." "Then find someone who does." She stood, her black dress flowing around her like armor. "Because either my husband is dead and someone went to extraordinary lengths to hide his identity, or he's alive and I'm going to find out why he wanted the world to think he was dead." As she walked toward the door, Santos called after her. "Mrs. Westfield, what will you do if you are right, if he is alive?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and for the first time since the phone call that had shattered her world, she smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Inspector, I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to build a case that will destroy him." The investigation deepens. The DNA results would take 72 hours. Zara spent those 3 days transforming from grieving widow into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She checked into the Four Seasons Ritz Lisbon, a decision that would have made Douglas proud under different circumstances. He'd always insisted on the best hotels, the finest restaurants, the kind of luxury that announced your importance to the world. Now she sat in the marble-appointed suite, surrounded by evidence that painted a picture of systematic deception stretching back months, possibly years. The knock on her door came at 2 a.m. on the 3rd night. "Mrs. Westfield?" The voice was unfamiliar, heavily accented. "My name is Victor Petrov. I believe we need to talk." Through the pee-hole she saw a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered and well-dressed, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen too much of the world's darker corners. This was the Victor from Douglas's sleep-talking, the name that had made her husband drop his coffee cup in fear. Every instinct screamed at her not to open the door, but every instinct had also told her that Douglas would never betray her, and look how that turned out.
"Mr. Petrov," she said, opening the door but keeping the chain engaged. "It's rather late for a social call." "Mrs. Westfield, your husband owes me $37 million. His English was precise, each word carefully enunciated. "I think you'll find that makes any hour appropriate for our conversation." She studied his face through the narrow opening. He didn't look like a man who made idle threats, but he also didn't look like someone who would hurt her without cause. There was something almost apologetic in his expression. "How do I know you're not here to kill me? Because if I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He held up his hands, showing they were empty. "Mrs. Westfield, I have information about your husband's death that I think you'll find very interesting." She closed the door, disengaged the chain, and opened it again. Viktor Petrov stepped into the suite with the careful movements of a man accustomed to dangerous situations, his eyes automatically scanning the room for threats or exits. "Drink," she offered, moving to the minibar with studied casualness. "Thank you. Vodka, if you have it." She poured 2 glasses, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "So, tell me about my husband's debt." Viktor accepted the glass but didn't drink. 3 years ago, Douglas came to me with a proposition. He needed funding for a project that his board would never approve, something involving cryptocurrency mining operations in Eastern Europe. Very profitable, but also very gray area, legally speaking. Douglas doesn't gamble with company money. No, but he gambles with borrowed money when he's desperate. The SEC investigation into Westfield Industries' accounting practices has been much more thorough than the public realizes. Your husband was facing criminal charges, Mrs. Westfield. Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, crimes that would have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. The vodka burned going down, but not as much as the words. "You're lying." "Am I?" Viktor reached into his jacket, slowly, telegraphing the movement, and withdrew a tablet. "These are the financial records from our business dealings. Every transaction, every payment, every missed deadline." The screen showed a complex web of financial transfers, shell companies, and cryptocurrency transactions. But what made Zara's blood run cold was Douglas's signature on dozens of documents, his handwriting as familiar as her own. "The last payment was due 2 weeks ago. When Douglas failed to make it, I came to Lisbon to collect. Imagine my surprise when I learned he died in a tragic fire." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that your husband is a very clever man who found a permanent solution to his temporary problem. Death, as they say, cancels all debts. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was living a double life? What would you do if you found out everything you believed about your marriage was a lie?" Zara set down her glass carefully, buying time while her mind raced. "If you're right, if he's alive, then you still have a problem. Dead men don't pay debts, but living men who fake their deaths are criminals. Turn him in to the authorities, and you'll never see your money." "Precisely." Viktor's approval was evident. "Which is why I'm hoping you might be able to help me locate him." "And why would I do that?" "Because, Mrs. Westfield, I think you're already looking for him, and I think you're the only person who might actually find him." The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. She was looking for him, had been from the moment she'd seen those inconsistent dental records, but hearing it said aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. "How do I know you're not here to kill me?" "Because if I wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation." He held up his hands, showing they were empty.
Mrs. Westfield, I have information about your husband's death that I think you'll find very interesting. She closed the door, disengaged the chain, and opened it again. Viktor Petrov stepped into the suite with the careful movements of a man accustomed to dangerous situations, his eyes automatically scanning the room for threats or exits. The next morning, the American consulate. The consulate officer was a thin, nervous man named Patterson, who clearly wished he was anywhere else. He kept glancing at his watch, as if timing how long he had to deal with the crazy widow who was asking uncomfortable questions about her husband's death. Mrs. Westfield, I understand you're grieving, but these conspiracy theories aren't helping anyone. He said, not quite meeting her eyes. The Portuguese authorities have been very thorough. The dental records, the wedding ring, the location of the body, everything confirms your husband's identity. Everything except the DNA, Zara said quietly. Patterson's face went pale. I'm sorry. I requested DNA testing. The results should be ready this morning. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to the register that had made witnesses confess to crimes they'd tried to hide. Mr. Patterson, how long have you been posted here in Lisbon? 3 years, but I don't see what... You know Douglas. Long enough to have processed his visa applications, his business permits, his various comings and goings. She studied his face, noting the slight tremor in his hands. Did you know him well? We'd met on several occasions, business matters, you understand. I'm sure. She pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo of Douglas taken at their anniversary party last year. He was laughing at something she had said, his eyes bright with genuine happiness. Does this look like a man who was planning to fake his own death? Patterson glanced at the photo, then quickly away. Mrs. Westfield, I really think you should consider grief counseling. What you're going through is completely normal, but these fantasies about your husband still being alive? Mr. Patterson, her voice cut through the platitudes like a blade. I spent 12 years as a prosecutor. I know when someone is lying to me. And right now, you are lying. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Patterson's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. I can't help you, he said finally. Can't or won't. Mrs. Westfield, there are things, situations, that are above my pay grade. If you're smart, and I think you are, you'll take your husband's remains back to America and try to move on with your life. And if I don't, Patterson's laugh was bitter, then you might find out that some dead men are more dangerous than living ones. That evening, Zara's hotel room. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email at 7:43 p.m. Non-match. The remains tested show no genetic relationship to the provided samples. Zara stared at the screen until the words blurred together. Part of her had been hoping she was wrong, that grief had made her paranoid, that Douglas really was dead and she could mourn him properly before trying to rebuild her life. But the larger part, the part that had made her a formidable prosecutor, felt a savage satisfaction. She was right. Douglas was alive, and he'd orchestrated an elaborate fraud to escape his problems. The question was, where was he now? She pulled up the financial records she'd been studying, cross-referencing them with the travel logs Viktor had shown her. A pattern emerged. Payments to a shell company in Montenegro, flight records showing regular trips to the Balkans, property purchases in countries that didn't have extradition treaties with the United States.
Douglas had been planning this for months, maybe years. Every business trip, every late night at the office, every time he'd claimed to be working on the European expansion, he'd been building his escape route. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Hotel bar, 10 p.m. Come alone. She stared at the message, her heart hammering. It could be Viktor, or Patterson, or any number of people who'd been drawn into Douglas's web of deception. But it could also be...
At 9:58 p.m., she walked into the hotel bar. The space was dimly lit, designed for intimate conversations and clandestine meetings. Most of the tables were empty, just a few business travelers nursing drinks and checking their phones. In the corner booth, partially hidden by shadows, sat a figure she recognized despite the beard and the different hair color. Douglas. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment his mask slipped. She saw him as he really was, frightened, desperate, older than his 52 years. Then he smiled, and it was the same charming expression that had swept her off her feet 8 years ago. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, as if they'd just met for a normal dinner date. "You look beautiful." Zara slid into the booth across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "You son of a bitch. I deserved that." He signaled the waitress for 2 drinks, her usual gin and tonic, his Scotch neat. "I know you must have questions." "Questions?" Her voice was barely controlled. "Douglas, I planned your funeral. I picked out your casket. I wrote your eulogy." "I know." His voice was soft, regretful. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Sorry?" The word came out as a hiss. "You're sorry? You destroyed my life, made me question everything I thought I knew about us, about you, about our marriage, and you're sorry?" "Zara, please keep your voice down." He glanced around nervously. "This is complicated. There are people looking for me, dangerous people. If they find me, good." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "I hope they find you. I hope they make you pay for what you've done." "You don't understand. The SEC investigation, the criminal charges. I was going to prison. 20 to life minimum. I couldn't do that to you. Couldn't make you live with that shame. So instead you made me live with the shame of being a widow whose husband would rather die than face his problems with her." She shook her head. "How long have you been planning this?" 2 years. He looked down at his hands. "Maybe longer. The cryptocurrency investments went bad. The SEC started sniffing around. Victor started making threats. I needed an exit strategy. And I wasn't part of that strategy? I was going to send for you once I got settled. There's a house in Montenegro, beautiful place overlooking the Adriatic. We could have been happy there. After you let me think you were dead for how long? A year? 5 years? Forever?" Douglas didn't answer, which was answer enough. "You never intended to send for me," she realized. "This was always goodbye." "Zara, no. You don't get to Zara me. You don't get to sit there and pretend this was about protecting me. This was about protecting yourself, and you were willing to destroy me to do it. I love you." The words came out desperate, pleading. "I've always loved you. That was never a lie. But everything else was." She looked down at him, this man she'd shared her life with, her bed with, her dreams with, the business trips, the late nights, the mysterious phone calls. How much of our marriage was real, Douglas? Everything, every moment we shared, every laugh, every lie. She pulled off her wedding ring, the diamond catching the bar's dim light. "You want to know what I learned about you these past few days? You've been planning this since before we got married. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the fake identities. You've been building your escape route for 8 years. She dropped the ring on the table between them. It made a small, final sound against the wood. "Sarah, wait!" But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the finality of a judge's gavel. Behind her, she heard Douglas call her name, but she didn't turn around. She had work to do. Zara didn't go back to her hotel room. Instead, she walked through Lisbon's winding streets until she found herself at the edge of the Tagus River, where the city's lights danced on the dark water like scattered diamonds. The night air was warm and salt-tinged, carrying the sounds of distant music and laughter from the restaurants and bars that lined the waterfront. She pulled out her phone and dialed Victor's number. "Mr. Petrov, it's Zara Westfield. I found him." "Where?" "That's not the right question." She watched a ferry cross the river, its lights cutting through the darkness. "The right question is, what are you willing to do to get your money back?" "I'm listening."
My husband is very clever, but he's also very predictable. He thinks he's won, thinks he's outsmarted everyone, but he made one critical mistake, which is, he underestimated his wife. She smiled, and it was the same expression that had terrified defense attorneys in Manhattan. Meet me at the Westfield Industries building tomorrow at noon. And Mr. Petrov, bring your documentation. All of it. She hung up and dialed another number. Inspector Santos. Inspector, it's Zara Westfield. I have information about my husband's death that I think you'll find very interesting. The next day, 11:45 a.m. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of the Westfield Industries building. Zara stood across the street, watching as various figures converged on the location she'd specified. Victor arrived first, accompanied by two men who looked like they'd stepped out of a gangster movie. Inspector Santos came next, flanked by Portuguese police officers. Patterson from the American consulate looked nervous as he climbed out of his official vehicle. And Douglas, she could see him now, hidden in the shadows of a nearby cafe, watching the gathering with growing alarm. At exactly noon, she walked across the street and stood before the assembled group. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding courtrooms. "Victor, Mr. Petrov, it's Zara Westfield. I found him." "Where?" "That's not the right question." She watched a ferry cross the river, its lights cutting through the darkness. "The right question is, what are you willing to do to get your money back?" "I'm listening." "My husband is very clever, but he's also very predictable. He thinks he's won, thinks he's outsmarted everyone, but he made one critical mistake, which is, he underestimated his wife." She smiled, and it was the same expression that had terrified defense attorneys in Manhattan. "Meet me at the Westfield Industries building tomorrow at noon. And Mr. Petrov, bring your documentation. All of it." She hung up and dialed another number. Inspector Santos. "Inspector, it's Zara Westfield. I have information about my husband's death that I think you'll find very interesting." The next day, 11:45 a.m. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of the Westfield Industries building. Zara stood across the street, watching as various figures converged on the location she'd specified. Victor arrived first, accompanied by two men who looked like they'd stepped out of a gangster movie. Inspector Santos came next, flanked by Portuguese police officers. Patterson from the American consulate looked nervous as he climbed out of his official vehicle. And Douglas, she could see him now, hidden in the shadows of a nearby cafe, watching the gathering with growing alarm. At exactly noon, she walked across the street and stood before the assembled group. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding courtrooms.
Patterson's face went white. That's completely false. The payments are traced to your personal account, Mr. Patterson. $50,000 transferred from a shell company controlled by my husband." She handed Santos another folder. Bank records, wire transfer confirmations, even the emails arranging the transaction. "What would you do if you discovered that your spouse had been planning to abandon you for years? How far would you go to get justice?" Victor was studying the building's facade with professional interest. "Mrs. Westfield, who died in that fire?" "An excellent question. According to the coroner's report, the body was that of a homeless man, approximately 50 years old, who died of a heroin overdose approximately 6 hours before the fire started." She met Victor's eyes. "My husband is many things, but he's not a murderer. He simply repurposed an existing corpse." "Jesus Christ!" Santos breathed. "Indeed. The fire was set to destroy evidence of the body switch and to provide cover for my husband's disappearance. The malfunctioning sprinkler system wasn't an accident. It was sabotage." She turned to address the group, her voice taking on the rhythm of a closing argument.
Douglas Westfield orchestrated an elaborate fraud to escape criminal prosecution and financial obligations. He corrupted American diplomatic officials, bribed Portuguese authorities, and desecrated the body of a homeless man to achieve his goals. "Where is he now, Victor?" Her voice was deadly quiet. "Listening, aren't you, darling?" Douglas emerged from the shadows of the cafe, his face a mask of resignation and fury. He changed clothes since the night before, expensive casual wear that made him look like a wealthy tourist, but his eyes were wild, desperate. "Very clever, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying across the street. "I always knew you were the smartest person in the room. Not smart enough to see through 8 years of lies, but smart enough to learn from my mistakes." Douglas approached slowly, his hands visible, trying to project calm confidence. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife is understandably upset about my necessary deception, but I'm sure we can work something out." $37 million, Victor said flatly, "plus interest." "I don't have $37 million. My accounts have been frozen, my assets seized. The SEC investigation is over." Zara's voice cut through his protests. "I withdrew the complaint this morning." The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas stared at her, his face cycling through confusion, hope, and finally growing dread. "What do you mean?" he asked slowly. "I mean, darling, that you're no longer a fugitive from justice. The SEC has closed its investigation based on new evidence I provided, evidence that clears you of all criminal wrongdoing." Douglas's eyes narrowed. "What evidence?" "The evidence that proves you were being blackmailed by Viktor Petrov into participating in illegal cryptocurrency schemes. The evidence that shows you were trying to extract yourself from criminal activity, not initiate it." She smiled sweetly. "The evidence that makes you a victim, not a perpetrator." Victor's face went very still. "Mrs. Westfield, exactly what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that the real criminal in this situation is you, Mr. Petrov. You've been using legitimate businessmen to launder money through cryptocurrency operations, then eliminating them when they became liabilities." She pulled out another folder. "I have documentation of 12 other cases across Eastern Europe where businessmen mysteriously died or disappeared after failing to pay debts to your organization. You're making a very serious accusation." "I'm making a very provable accusation." She gestured to Inspector Santos. "Inspector, I believe you'll find that Mr. Petrov is wanted by Interpol in connection with several international money laundering operations." He was already on his radio, calling for backup. The two men flanking Victor began to look nervous, their hands moving instinctively towards concealed weapons. "Mrs. Westfield," he said carefully, "I think you're making a mistake." "The only mistake I made was trusting my husband." She looked at Douglas, her eyes cold, "but I've corrected that error." Douglas was staring at her with something approaching awe. "Zara, what have you done?" "I've saved your life, and I've destroyed it." She turned to Inspector Santos. "Inspector, I believe you have arrests to make." As Victor and his men were led away in handcuffs, Douglas stood alone in the street, the check trembling in his hands. He looked up at Zara, and she saw the man she'd married flickering behind his eyes, vulnerable, lost, human. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know, but sorry doesn't fix what you broke." She walked away, leaving him standing in the shadow of the building where he'd supposedly died, clutching $50,000 and the ruins of his life. That evening, the hotel bar. Zara sat in the same booth where she'd confronted Douglas the night before, nursing a gin and tonic and staring out at the Lisbon skyline. The city looked different now, less like the scene of a tragedy and more like the backdrop for a new beginning. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Thank you. D. She deleted it without replying. Another text, this one from Inspector Santos. Victor Petrov was arrested by Interpol. Turns out you were right about the money laundering. How did you know? I didn't, but I knew he was dangerous, and I knew Douglas was desperate enough to believe any story that offered him a way out. What about your husband? What about him? Are you going to prosecute him for the fraud?
Considered the question, swirling the gin in her glass. Douglas was trapped in a prison of his own making. No ID, no resources, no way back to the life he'd destroyed. He would spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder, wondering if his past would catch up with him. It was a more fitting punishment than prison. No, she typed back. Some people create their own punishment. I think Douglas is one of them. She finished her drink and walked out of the bar, leaving behind the ruins of her marriage and the man who'd tried to leave her with nothing but grief and lies. Outside, Lisbon glittered in the darkness, full of possibility and new beginnings. 6 months later, New York City. The law offices of Westfield and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Central Park. Zara stood at those windows now, watching the autumn leaves dance in the wind, a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, and a satisfied smile on her lips. Mrs. Westfield, her assistant's voice came through the intercom. Your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Send him in, please. The door opened, and Inspector Santos entered, looking uncomfortable in his formal suit, but carrying himself with the quiet dignity that had made him such an effective ally in Lisbon. He'd flown to New York specifically for this meeting, and Zara suspected she knew why. Inspector, she said, gesturing to the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. Thank you for coming. How was your flight? Long, but worth it. He settled into the chair, his dark eyes studying her with professional interest. You look well, Mrs. Westfield. Success suits you. Thank you. She sat across from him, noting the manila folder he'd placed on the table. I take it this isn't a social call. No, it's not. He opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents. We found Victor Petrov. Zara's eyebrows rose. Found him? I thought he was in custody. He was. He escaped during transport to The Hague 3 weeks ago. Santos's expression was grim. We found his body yesterday, floating in the Tagus River. Professional execution. Very clean. I see. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Any idea who? The working theory is that his former employers decided he'd become too much of a liability. These organizations don't tolerate failure, and his arrest exposed their entire Portuguese operation. Santos leaned forward, his voice dropping. Mrs. Westfield, there's something else. We found evidence that Petrov had been tracking you. Photos, travel records, even surveillance footage from this building. The coffee cup rattled slightly as she set it down. Tracking me? Why? We think he blamed you for his downfall. The evidence you provided, the way you manipulated the situation, it destroyed his entire network. Santos pulled out a photograph showing Zara entering her building. This was taken 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, he was supposed to be in custody. He'd been planning his escape for months. Mrs. Westfield, I think you were his primary target once he got free. Zara stared at the photograph, her mind racing. She'd been so focused on rebuilding her life, on establishing her new law practice, that she'd almost forgotten about the dangerous men Douglas had entangled them with.
"But he's dead now," she said slowly. "Yes, but there are others. Victor's organization doesn't just disappear because he's gone." Santos closed the folder. "Mrs. Westfield, I think you should consider relocating, at least temporarily." "Inspector, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not running from shadows. I've already run from enough in my life. This isn't about running, it's about survival." Before Zara could respond, her assistant's voice came through the intercom again. "Mrs. Westfield, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says it's urgent. A Mr. Douglas Westfield." The silence in the room was deafening. Santos's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, while Zara felt the blood drain from her face. "Send him in," she said quietly. The door opened, and Douglas entered. He looked like a different man, thinner, weathered, his expensive clothes replaced by simple jeans and a worn leather jacket. His hair was longer, graying at the temples, and there were new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. "Hello, Zara," he said, his voice hoarse. "Inspector Santos? Mr. Westfield, you're supposed to be dead." "I am dead, officially. I've been dead for 6 months, and let me tell you, it's not nearly as restful as advertised." "What do you want, Douglas?" Zara's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "To save your life." He moved closer, his movements careful and deliberate. "Viktor Petrov escaped from custody 3 weeks ago. He's been hunting you." "Was," Santos corrected. "He's dead." "Dead? When?" "Yesterday." "Why? What do you know about this?" "I know that Victor wasn't working alone. I know that his death means his partners are going to be very interested in tying up loose ends." He looked at Zara, his eyes intense. "I know that you're in danger, and it's my fault." "It's always your fault," Zara said coldly. "That's the one constant in this entire nightmare." "You're right, but that doesn't change the fact that men are coming for you, and they won't be as reasonable as Victor was." Santos stepped forward. "What men? Who are we talking about?" "The Bratva, Russian organized crime." Douglas ran his hands through his hair. "Victor was their frontman for Western European operations. When you brought him down, you cost them millions in lost revenue and exposed their entire network." "And they blame me for that?" "They blame us both, Taga, but you're the one who's still alive and accessible." Douglas's voice was urgent. "Zara, you need to disappear. Tonight. Maybe forever." "I'm not running." "Then you're going to die." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. "These are not men you can outsmart or outmaneuver. They're killers, and they're coming for you." "What would you do if the person who betrayed you most came back trying to save your life? Can someone who destroyed your trust ever truly redeem themselves?" Zara stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had become her sanctuary. 6 months ago, she was a grieving widow. Now she was a successful attorney with her own practice, representing clients who'd been betrayed by the people they trusted most. She'd built a new life from the ashes of her old one, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not Russian criminals, not Victor's ghost, not even Douglas, take it away from her. "There's another option," she said slowly. "What?" both men asked simultaneously. "We finish what we started in Lisbon." She turned back to them, her expression determined. "We give them what they want." "Tagra, what are you talking about?" "They want justice for Victor's death. They want someone to pay for their losses." She moved to her desk, pulling out a thick folder. "So, we give them someone to blame."
She opened the folder, revealing photographs, financial records, and travel documents. "Meet Anthony Torino. international financial consultant. He's been laundering money for Eastern European criminal organizations for the past 5 years. He's responsible for the security breaches that led to Victor's capture. Santos stared at the documents. Mrs. Westfield, who is Anthony Torino? He doesn't exist. Yet. She looked at Douglas. But he could. With the right documentation, the right background, the right sacrifice. Understanding dawned in Douglas's eyes. You want me to become the fall guy. I want you to become the solution. Anthony Torino confesses to betraying Victor Petrov. He provides evidence of his crimes, then dies in a tragic accident before he can be arrested. The Bratva gets their justice, their money gets returned, and everyone goes home happy. Except Anthony Torino, Douglas said dryly. Except Anthony Torino. Zara's smile was sharp. But Douglas Westfield is already dead, remember? So technically, no one gets hurt. Santos was shaking his head. This is insane. You're talking about an elaborate fraud to fool international criminals. I'm talking about the only solution that doesn't end with all of us dead. Zara pulled out a chair and sat down. Douglas, you said you wanted to save my life. Here's your chance. And if I refuse? Then you walk out that door, and we never see each other again. But the Bratva will still come for me, and I'll handle them my own way. Which is, I'll disappear. New identity, new life, new everything. She met his eyes. And I'll make sure that every law enforcement agency in the world knows exactly where to find Douglas Westfield. The threat hung between them, unspoken, but understood. Douglas would spend the rest of his short life running from both criminals and police, while Zara would be forced to abandon everything she'd built. There's a third option, Douglas said quietly. Which is, we face them together, as partners. Zara laughed, but there was no humor in it. Partners. Douglas, you tried to fake your own death rather than trust me with your problems. What makes you think I'd ever partner with you again? Because despite everything, we're good together. We always were. He moved closer, his voice dropping. You outmaneuvered Victor, exposed his network, and saved my life all at the same time. I could never have done that alone. And I did it without you. But you could do it better with me. He gestured to the folder. This Anthony Torino plan, it's brilliant, but it's incomplete. You need someone who understands how these organizations work, who knows their weaknesses. And you do? I spent 2 years being hunted by them. I learned a few things about staying alive. Douglas's smile was self-deprecating. Besides, I owe you for everything. Santos cleared his throat. If I might interrupt this reunion, we have a more immediate problem. My sources say the Bratva team is already in New York. They'll move within the next 48 hours. Then we need to move faster. Zara stood, her mind already working through the logistics. Douglas, if we do this, if we work together, it's not a reconciliation, it's not a second chance, it's a business arrangement. I understand. I'll never trust you again, I'll never love you again. When this is over, you disappear, and I never see you again. I understand. And if you betray me, even once, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a federal prison. I understand. She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of the man who'd been willing to destroy her to save himself. Instead, she saw something she'd never seen before. Genuine remorse, and maybe even a kind of peace. All right, she said finally. Partners, one last time. 48 hours later, the trap. The meeting was set for midnight at the South Street Seaport, a location that offered multiple escape routes and enough ambient noise to mask any unpleasantness. Zara was sitting in the back of a black sedan watching the harbor lights dance on the water while Douglas made final preparations. Are you sure about this? He asked, adjusting the wire taped to his chest. No, but I'm sure about the alternative. She checked her watch. 5 minutes.
They'd spent the last 2 days creating Anthony Torino's complete identity, financial records, travel documents, even a fake social media presence going back years. The story was simple. Torino had been skimming money from the Bratva's operations, and when Victor discovered the theft, Torino had fed information to the authorities to eliminate his only witness. It was a story that would satisfy the Russians' need for justice, while providing them with a concrete target for their revenge. "I'm sure they'll settle for money," his voice whispered. "No, I need to be sure that they won't come back for me later." "Remember the script," she murmured back. "You're Anthony Torino. You're scared, you're guilty, and you're willing to do anything to make this right. Copy that." The next hour was the longest of Zara's life. She listened as Douglas, as Anthony Torino, confessed to crimes he'd never committed, apologized for betrayals he'd never made, and negotiated his own execution with men who would have killed him regardless of his guilt or innocence. "They're buying it," he whispered during a brief moment when the Russians stepped away to confer. "The documentation is solid. They want the money locations. Give them the accounts, empty shells, but they'll look legitimate for a few hours. What about, shh, they're coming back." The final negotiation lasted another 20 minutes. The Russians wanted proof of Torino's betrayal, wanted to watch him suffer, wanted to make an example that would discourage future betrayals. "They're moving," he whispered. "Black sedan heading north on FDR Drive." "I see you." She started her car, falling into traffic several cars behind. "Are you all right?" "Terrified, but all right." The convoy headed toward the Bronx, eventually stopping at an abandoned warehouse in a district that had seen better decades. Zara watched from a distance as Douglas was led inside, his hands zip-tied behind his back. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. For the next hour, Douglas would be completely on his own, selling the fiction that he was Anthony Torino, while Zara put the final pieces of their trap into motion. She made 3 phone calls. The first was to Inspector Santos, who was coordinating with the FBI from his hotel room. "It's time," she said simply. The second was to the offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, authorizing the transfer of $50 million from accounts the Russians didn't know existed. The third was to Douglas. "Phase 2, she whispered. Inside the warehouse, Douglas was providing the final details of Anthony Torino's betrayal when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face going pale. "What is it?" one of the Russians demanded. "The money," Douglas whispered. "Someone's moving the money." The Russians snatched the phone, staring at the banking alerts showing massive transfers out of their accounts. $50 million, their entire New York operation fund, was vanishing into the digital ether. "You set us up," the leader snarled, pulling out a gun. "No, I swear, I don't know what's happening." Douglas's terror was completely genuine. "Someone else, someone who knows about the accounts." "Who?" "I don't know. Maybe Victor had a partner. Maybe—" The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. But it wasn't aimed at Douglas. Instead, the Russian leader had shot out the warehouse's main electrical panel, plunging the space into darkness. "Nobody moves," he shouted. "Nobody breathes. We're getting out of here." But they were too late. The warehouse was already surrounded by FBI agents, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Bullhorns echoed through the space, ordering everyone to the ground. In the chaos that followed, Douglas rolled behind a shipping container while the Russians engaged in a brief, futile gunfight with federal agents. When the smoke cleared, 2 of the Russians were dead, and the third was in custody. Anthony Torino had simply vanished. 1 week later, Martha's Vineyard. The cottage overlooked the Atlantic Ocean, its weathered shingles and white trim giving it the comfortable, timeless feel of old New England money. Zara sat on the deck, a glass of wine in her hand and a satisfied smile on her lips as she watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "You know," Douglas said, settling into the chair beside her, I never thought I'd see another sunset. Don't get too comfortable, she replied. This is temporary. I know. He accepted the glass of wine she offered, their fingers barely touching. Thank you, by the way, for everything. Don't thank me yet. The FBI will want to debrief you for weeks. The Russians will eventually figure out that Anthony Torino never existed, and you'll still need to disappear when this is all over. I know. He was quiet for a moment, watching the waves crash against the shore. Zara, what we did back there, working together, trusting each other, it felt like old times? She shook her head. Douglas, what we did was survival. Don't mistake it for forgiveness. I'm not, but I'm not ready to pretend it meant nothing either. She turned to study him, this man who'd been her husband, her enemy, and now something she didn't have a name for. The Douglas sitting beside her was different from the one who'd tried to fake his own death. He was quieter, more thoughtful, marked by the kind of suffering that either destroyed people or made them stronger. What will you do, she asked, when this is over? I don't know. Start over, I guess. Maybe somewhere quiet where they don't ask too many questions about your past. And what about us? There is no us, Zara. You made that clear. You destroyed that when you chose to fake your death rather than trust me with your problems. Yes, you did. But if there was an us, if we could start over completely, would you want to? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and pain. Zara considered it, turning the thought over in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. I don't know, she said finally. The man I married, the man I loved, he died in that warehouse fire in Lisbon. I don't know who you are now. Neither do I. Douglas's smile was rueful. But I think I'd like to find out. And I think I'd like to find out who I am without you. She stood, moving to the deck railing. Douglas, I need you to promise me something. Anything. When this is over, when the FBI is done with you, and the Russians have given up looking, I need you to disappear, completely. No contact, no checking up on me, no watching from a distance. I need to know that you're gone. And if I can't promise that, then I'll make sure you disappear permanently. Her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. Don't test me. He nodded slowly. I promise. Good. She moved toward the door, then paused. Douglas. Yes? Just for what it's worth, I think the man you're becoming might be worth knowing. Just not by you. Just not by me. 3 months later, Zara's new office. The offices of Westfield and Associates had moved to a larger space in Midtown, with room for 12 attorneys and support staff. Zara stood in her corner office, looking out at the city she had claimed as her own, when her assistant knocked on the door.
Mrs. Westfield? There's a package for you. No return address. Inside the manila envelope was a single photograph, a beach cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean with a man sitting on the deck reading a book. The man was tanned and relaxed, his hair longer than she remembered, his face peaceful in a way she'd never seen before. On the back of the photo, in handwriting she recognized, was a single word: happy. She studied the image for a long moment, then placed it in her desk drawer. She wouldn't keep it, she decided, but she wouldn't throw it away either, at least not yet. Her phone buzzed, a text from her assistant. Marcus Chen is here for the 3 o'clock appointment. Says he's been embezzled by his business partner. Zara smiled. Marcus Chen was a tech entrepreneur whose partner had stolen $3 million and disappeared to Thailand. It was exactly the kind of case that had made her reputation: betrayal, deception, and a client who deserved justice. Send him in, she replied. As she prepared for the meeting, she caught her reflection in the office window. The woman looking back at her was confident, powerful, successful. She'd built a practice representing people who'd been betrayed by those they trusted most, and she was very good at her job. It was a different life than the one she'd planned, but it was hers, completely, utterly hers. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting back what you lost, but discovering you're stronger than you ever imagined. What would you do if you had to rebuild your entire life from scratch? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 1 year later. The wedding was small, held in the garden of Zara's Greenwich estate. She'd kept the house. Douglas had signed it over to her as part of their divorce settlement, but she'd made it her own. The rooms where they'd shared their marriage were now filled with new furniture, new artwork, new memories. Her husband was a federal judge named Michael Thompson, a man 10 years her senior who'd never been married and had no interest in playing games with her heart. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of honest communication that Zara had learned to value above all else. "You look radiant," her sister whispered as they waited for the ceremony to begin. "I feel peaceful," Zara replied, adjusting her simple white dress. "Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." The ceremony was beautiful, filled with friends and family who'd watched her transform from a broken woman into someone stronger than she ever imagined. When Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt no echo of the past, no ghost of another man's promises. This was her life now, her choice, her love, her future. After the reception, as the last guests were leaving, Zara noticed a small box on the gift table. Inside was a single white rose and a note. "Congratulations, you deserve every happiness. A friend." She recognized the handwriting, but instead of the pain she'd expected, she felt only a distant kind of sadness. Somewhere in the world, Douglas was building a new life, just as she had. The difference was that hers was built on truth, while his would always be founded on the lie of who he'd been. She dropped the note into the trash and walked back to her new husband, who was waiting for her with a smile that held no secrets, no hidden agendas, no carefully constructed deceptions. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, offering her his arm. "Ready," she said, and meant it. As they walked toward the house, she felt the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. She'd loved Douglas Westfield with everything she had, and he'd nearly destroyed her for it. But from that destruction, she'd built something better, a life that was entirely her own, a love that was built on truth, and a future that held nothing but possibility.
Behind them, the wind scattered the rose petals from the ceremony, carrying them away into the night like whispers of what had been. But Zara didn't look back. She'd learned that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was living well. And she was living very well indeed.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.